Right, that looks like everyone who is waiting in the waiting room is now in. So, welcome everyone to this seminar on changing futures and the next phase of public service reform. I'm Andrew Laird. I'm the Chief Executive of Mutual Ventures and really delighted to be hosting this webinar. At Mutual Ventures, we're a consultancy that works at a national and a local level, essentially trying to make public services more effective when it comes to supporting real people and families to tackle the challenges they face. And if you're here today, then you more than likely agree with all of us that public services which are centered around real people rather than service silos are not only better, but cost less at the end of the day. And I'm delighted to be joined by amazing colleagues here today. This seminar was a joint idea of Hannah Hessel-Greaves, Mark Smith, and I. Hannah is a professor at Manchester Metropolitan University at the Policy and Evaluation Research Unit, otherwise known as Peru. Hannah, it's great to see you. How are you? You well?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. And then Mark Smith is the former lead for Changing Futures Northumbria and is now a visiting professor of public service innovation at Peru, as well as a freelance public service reform consultant. And we're really lucky at Mutual Ventures to have the chance to work with Mark a bit on some of our projects. Mark, it's great to see you.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Morning, everyone. Looking forward to the next couple of hours.
And then also, we're really delighted to be joined by three other uh, fantastic panelists here. So, Jenny Yules is the program lead for Changing Futures at MHCLG. Jenny, it's great to see you.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And then Bobby Lowen is the program director at Changing Futures Nottingham. It's good to see you, Bobby.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks again for the invitation to be on this morning. Really looking forward to the discussions.
Brilliant. And then Thomas Johnson is the head of reform strategy and policy at Greater Manchester Combined Authority and is also the lead for Changing Futures across Greater Manchester. Really good to have you on board, Thomas.
Yeah, hello, and looking forward to getting to the conversation.
Brilliant. So why are we here today and why is this important now? So it's fair to say that there is a bit of disruption and distraction at the top of government, but the work of public service reform must continue. And I'm sure everybody listening today would absolutely agree with that. So the big news and the main reason we're here today is that the government has announced a new phase of funding for Changing Futures, which is great news for those areas who have been fortunate enough to get the funding. So now feels like a good moment to reflect back and look forward, not just on Changing Futures, but on public service reform more broadly. So to try and help with that, we've structured today's conversation in two parts. The first part will look at the Changing Futures journey so far, specifically what the programme has already shown about working differently with people facing multiple disadvantage. But we will also get into how Changing Futures connects to the wider public service reform agenda, including Test, Learn and Grow, place-based budgets, the Work Well programme, and the broader and growing movement towards more relational public services. A central theme of the discussion will be that Changing Futures and these other programs should not be seen as just another pilot. They must be understood as an enabler and catalyst for more fundamental and sustainable change. So that's the first part of the day. The second part of the seminar will focus on the more practical lessons from the first phase of Changing Futures. So what should you be thinking about right now? And this advice applies to pretty much any reform program, not just Changing Futures. There's a lot of transferable ideas and knowledge there. So our panelists who have just introduced themselves have led reform at all levels, national policy level, frontline leadership, as well as learning and evaluation. So we're in really good hands. So whilst we have a structure, we don't have a script, so it should be free flowing, and who knows, anything could happen. But there's no script, and we're going to try and keep it as interesting and free flowing as possible. So in terms of housekeeping for those watching and listening, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, which will then allow you to put questions to us, and I will do my best to try and get through as many of those as possible. So with no further ado, I would love to introduce Jenny Yules, who is the MHCLG Changing Futures Programme Lead, who will talk a bit about what the programme is, what's happened so far, and what is coming up. And I will just share Jenny's slides. Jenny, do they look, can you see those okay?
Yes, I can see them. So I'm assuming everyone else can as well. Thank you, Andrew.
Excellent.
Well,
Over to you.
Thanks again for inviting me. It's great to have an opportunity to share some of the learning about the programme a bit more widely and the exciting, developments coming up. So just very briefly, in terms of my background, I started my career in academic research and then consultancy in the field of community safety and criminal justice. And then wanting to get more hands-on, I worked for 16 years in local government, and then became the head of the Changing Futures programme for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government back in November 23. So it's a real passion of mine to bring the local and the central together. It's been a real privilege to be able to bring some of that learning from the local into sort of central policy. So what is Changing Futures? There may some of you may never have heard of the programme. It's built on the premise that, as we know, that there are individuals who experience multiple disadvantage. So that's a combination of interconnected needs and challenges, including homelessness and rough sleeping, substance misuse, poor mental health, interaction with the criminal justice system, and domestic abuse. And current systems do not always serve them well because those individuals are often trapped in really damaging cycles of repeated trauma, bouncing in and out of crisis services without actually receiving the support that they need. And they experience lower life expectancy and hugely damaging, outcomes really from that interaction. And also the costs to the public service system are up to 5 times higher than for a sort of average citizen, if you like. So we know that local systems can work really well for some people, but often for this group of people that are experiencing these interconnected, complex, different needs, they don't work well because they've been designed to deal with one element, such as poor mental health, and not interconnected needs. There have been, obviously, over recent decades, and people as long in the tooth as I am will be aware of, has probably been working in many of the different initiatives that bring different services together. And there was the social exclusion unit at the turn of this century, supporting families, of course, that work with families with interconnected needs. And then there was the National Lotteries programme, Fulfilling Lives, and the meme approach. And then government decided to fund the Changing Futures programme to test and build evidence essentially. So that's the kind of the background and the premise. And so I decided not to go into too much detail into that because I think people will probably be familiar really with that. So Andrew, if you don't mind going on to the next slide, please, for a, is it gonna work? Yeah, brilliant. So what is it? I mentioned the different forms of multiple disadvantage, and they're listed on the left. So the way that we define it across the programme is 3 or more of those 5, but also, really importantly, repeat crisis contacts across the public services. So the ones that you will imagine, including A&E, police, safeguarding, etc., and that they're struggling to engage in that support. And on the bottom left is a chart to show the prevalence of those disadvantages ever experienced by the beneficiaries in the first Changing Futures phase, which was evaluated. And you can see that the levels of need is really, really high there. So the programme is cross-government from MHCLG, Department for Health and Social Care, Home Office, Ministry of Justice, Department for Work and Pensions, and the Cabinet Office. And we've got really strong buy-in across all those departments. And phase 1 was funded by some shared funding from Treasury and was very much a learning programme and supported 15 partnerships based on a bidding process, if you like. So there were a number of different partnerships that covered different geographies, such as coastal communities, counties, core cities, etc. And then more recently, as Andrew said, we've been successful in securing some funding to extend the programme, well, not extend, but to run a second phase of the programme, if you like, and evolve that approach, which is really exciting. And I'll talk a bit more about where that's focused. And the aims include both the better coordinated support for this cohort, I don't know like the word cohort, but people experiencing multiple disadvantage. We are aiming for just under 5,000 people in England for phase 2. It was just under 7,000 for the first phase over the 5 years. But also really, really importantly, lasting improvements in service integration. I was really delighted to hear Andrew saying that it's not just a pilot programme. This is about making that lasting change, that sustainable difference across partnership working, data, funding and commissioning. And then finally, what we feel is really important, as mentioned before, that link between local and central. So supporting that wider policy making across government to tackle multiple disadvantage. If you're able to, thank you very much. So what's it achieved? There are huge numbers of very long evaluation reports on the government websites. If you just Google changingfutures.gov.uk, you'll see a lot of different reports there. And with some of them are shorter infographics, and we've got practical guides as well. We're going to be doing a lot more work this year to try and disseminate that learning. So please feel free, if you want more details, to go and look at those. And many of them are different themes, such as trauma-informed working and risk and caseworkers, etc. But in terms of the headline outcomes for individuals that were supported by the programme, we saw really significant improvements. So we saw reductions in rough sleeping and homelessness, reductions in domestic abuse and other forms of victimisation. We saw significant improvements in well-being and mental health, and reduced substance misuse. We also saw reduced use of A&E and ambulance call-outs as well. So, and we were so proud of that, and proud of the areas doing that work, because we know that for individuals experiencing all these disadvantages, recovery can be very lengthy and is not a linear trajectory. And so, yeah, we were delighted with this, and the cost-benefit analysis came up with the figure of 1.8 in terms of the value for money. We also have really strong evidence base for what works to deliver this work. It is possible. It is really possible to support these individuals to have, long and fulfilling lives. To coin the phrase from the previous programme. So first of all, trusted caseworkers. So this is absolutely fundamental. Trusted caseworkers with lots of support and low caseloads, to be able to have that time to build relationships, to develop that trust with an individual, to really get to know them, to listen to them and understand what they want, and to provide that immediate practical and emotional support, as well as bringing in other services that are needed and help coordinate across the system. And they then are very much feeding into the learning across the partnership to develop that system change. So then secondly, obviously the specialist support that I mentioned, bringing in different support as needed, but the partnership backing that will then change those systems. So this is absolutely fundamental, both operational sort of level and strategic, in terms of that support to develop those person-centered problem-solving approaches. And we found through the evaluation that there was, significant system change in most areas. So that was really, really good, given the short timescales we're talking about. Sorry, Andrew, on to the next one. So where is it? So I mentioned the first phase was developed through a bidding process. And so as you can see from the map, we had different geographies, such as county-wide, such as Mark's area in Northumbria, and we had Sussex, Essex, etc., and Surrey and Lancashire, but also core cities such as Sheffield and Bristol, and then other areas like Plymouth and Stoke, slightly smaller, and of course Bobby's in Nottingham. And it was very much a learning sort of programme, if you like, and it was extended after 3 years for another 2 further years. So now the programme has developed that learning. It's about applying it in the areas of the highest need. Obviously, in an ideal world, we would have wanted to have scaled that out across the country, supporting family style. But given the sort of fiscal environment, unfortunately, that wasn't possible. But we did manage to secure the budget that we have. And so we focused that in the top tier local authority areas with the highest levels of multiple deprivation. and you can see those in the map on the right. There are 3 areas in Greater Manchester, so that's delivered through the Greater Manchester Combined Authority that Thomas is here from, and in West Midlands there are 3 areas there, so that's delivered through the West Midlands Combined Authority as well. And on to the next slide. Thank you, Andrew. I feel a bit like Chris Whitty here, asking for the next slide. So we are developing the programme and evolving it, and there's a really strong emphasis on system change. There always has been, but we are sticking with our 6 core programme principles because they're so important to the approach. So the first of the 6 is partnership working. I've already mentioned, given by definition the individuals that we're working with have multiple the disadvantages. Of course, it's vital that all the different partners are involved to help address those challenges. And so they need to be from the statutory and voluntary sector as well. So that really strong cross-sector partnership, both at strategic and operational level. And without that strategic buy-in, we are not going to get that long-term change. Secondly, coordinated support. It's about integrating those local services to enable that whole person approach and not send people into different services one by one and expecting them to tell their story again and again and be re-traumatized, but actually thinking about how services work together to support that person in that whole person approach. Thirdly, in terms of flexibility, thinking about that system-wide view. So sharing accountability, sharing risk management and ownership, ensuring there isn't a wrong door and that all the services are going to flex to the person rather than the person having to flex to the service. Fourthly, lived experience has been one of the really exciting things, I think, in Changing Futures. For me, I think it's been one of the big successes. So it's developing the involvement of lived experience throughout the programme. So from from sort of forums of people to having, right through to having peer support workers working alongside people through their journey to give them that inspiration, to give them, to have that shared empathy and shared understanding. But also right through governance, commissioning, informing the design of services in a really meaningful way. And also on a programme level, so people with lived experience have been involved in shaping the evaluation to the design of the programme and throughout and influencing policy. So that's been a really important thread and continues to be so. Relational working, of course, is at the absolute heart of the way that this programme works. And I know we coin these phrases all the time, but this is this work in action. You can see it as you go and speak to people involved, those trauma-informed approaches, but not just directly with the beneficiaries, but through the trauma-informed approach throughout the way of working and relational approaches across, the services, and both, in the governance of the programme as well as in the delivery. And that's what I think is so important and I love about the programme. And we like to think that we can do that as well between central and local at that relational approach as well. And then finally, really importantly, about that sustainability. And I know that this is really tough and a really tall order. And we're talking about 3 years or less than 3 years now, when really this is a long-term approach. But it's thinking right now, when we start the new phase, what can we do that will sustain beyond the funding in March 29? Next slide, thanks, Andrew. So in terms of the delivery model, there are 2 aspects that we're asking areas to do in the second phase. I think we're slightly more flexible in the first phase, but we are asking areas to provide that direct support for adults as well as the system change. We feel that the direct support funded through the programme can act as a catalyst and bring those partners to the table and provide that learning, if you like, for the system change. So we think that's really a really important part of it. But other than that, we are really very flexible, and the aim of the programme is for areas to work out how this best fits with what's already there. Because fundamentally, it's about this programme supporting the existing work and initiatives and investment. The absolute last thing we want this to be is a programme that is layered on top of existing complex interrelated programmes. It's not about that. It's about actually supporting what's already there, because we don't want it to come in as a programme and then come out and there's nothing left. So it's about using the funding in conjunction with other work, building on learning. We've got so much evidence there. It's not about starting from scratch. It's using what we know works through the first phase and other programs in terms of multidisciplinary teams and case conferencing, etc. And low caseloads. We're talking 10 to 12 people per key worker. And then, of course, I mentioned the resources, so drawing on that to support that work. And then for me, it's really important that we learn as a central department and colleagues across government to be able to share that, learn from areas, to share that learning and provide guidance. So we're developing some more guidance at the moment. We've got system change guidance already available and disseminate that learning. So that'll be a big focus of the next 3 years for us. But also to influence policy across government. So what we really love about the programme is hearing from areas about what we can do centrally and to better tackle multiple disadvantages. Okay, next slide. It's great, it gives me a chance to sip my tea between slides. And then just a couple of slides on what the model looks like. And it does vary significantly between areas, but the common themes that are throughout the programme are having the individual experience of multiple disadvantage at the centre, as supported by that trusted caseworker and peer support workers that can develop that trust with them. And then bringing in the other services. So some areas, and Bobby might talk about his, for example, have embedded workers sitting in police, in probation, in A&E, in custody, in mental health crisis suites. And they will be there where people present and support the services to to bring that wraparound support to that individual. Or it may be that those services are seconded into a multidisciplinary team. It's done in different ways in different areas. In Hull, for example, there is a physical hub where loads of different services are based, health services and others, and housing and DWP, etc. And so people can just drop in and the same in Blackpool as well, and other areas where they can drop in and get that support when they're ready for it and when they need it. And also in working together, those individuals can really change that learning in their own host organisations. In terms of referral in, this is a really important part of it in terms of not having those kind of fixed thresholds that exclude people, through stigma and risk, but thinking about really creative ways of bringing the people that need it into the service through identifying them through repeated crisis demand, repeated exclusion from support, etc. And this is where the use of data is really important in terms of identifying individuals that are often invisible to the data, if you like, but not to services. And it needs really proactive engagement. So people talk all the time about being really, really persistent, going out to where people are every day and to sort of build up that connection and that trust. And then also equally important is after that really intensive support has been provided, that flexible step down and recovery, avoiding that cliff edge, and ensuring that that person can be engaged in their local community or reconnected with their family, but with voluntary sector partners locally, so that they feel that they can belong in that community and have that support. And as a colleague was talking about the other day in a meeting, is talking about actually having that love. That's what sustains people, isn't it, in that community? And maybe we don't talk about that enough. But also having that ability to come back into services, because we know, as I said before, we don't expect people to have a very linear trajectory of recovery. People will hit bumps in the road and need to be able to come back into service and know that they can do that. So that's the sort of delivery part. In terms of system change, on the next slide, it's another phrase that we use all the time, and sometimes I think we can think, well, what actually does it mean? And I think it's worth thinking about it as transformational and sustainable over the long term. So something that we will see as a long-term change, as well as resulting in better outcomes for people experiencing multiple disadvantage. And it can look like better coordinated support, shared data across systems, different ways of structuring leadership and governance, co-commissioning, etc. But I think we all, in terms of we need to be realistic. We are never going to reach a state of a perfect system. We're always going to need to segment different services and have specialist services. And I think it's a really useful quote from the meme evaluation on the left about thinking it more in terms of a trajectory or a continuum of work rather than a state that we can reach itself, if you like. And just a couple more things on this. We're developing a system maturity framework for the second phase, which we do hope to publish at some stage so it can be used more widely. And this is really to help partnerships with to have a more practical tool to help them to identify where the gaps are and where their strengths are. So it's based on all the wealth of evidence we talked about, and also I think supporting families had a system maturity framework. There are plenty around, and some work we did with policy labs to identify healthy indicators for systems. And it's on a scale of from emerging to thriving. Partners can work through together a self-assessment that is under 6 themes of coordinated support, data and insight, leadership and governance, lived experience, workforce, and funding and commissioning, with examples of what really good looks like. And that's a really practical tool to help partners to get around the table and think, okay, what do we need to work on to move towards a really healthy system? And then to think about more broadly, on the next slide, Andrew, I feel really strongly that the programme can be a real movement for change more widely than just the sort of individuals that are supported through the programme. And it can be that catalyst for how, and that sort of learning for how we can work differently between central and local government. And one of the characteristics of the programme is a really strong network between areas and different government departments and our partner agencies to really work in a really collaborative way. And that's something I've been really enjoying in this role. We've learned so much from areas. They're so generous with that. But also we've had feedback from areas that they really do welcome when we come out and we visit the area, we talk, we bring government, other colleagues from across government out. And I think it helps the areas to feel valued and to showcase their work and have their challenges aired and shared with us, and we can bring that back into the centre. And that's something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next slides. But other things that we do to develop that network, we have lots of in-person programme learning events. We have communities of practice. We've developed a system change learning programme that we're going to work through with the new areas over a 6-session programme. We are just in the process of commissioning 2 support providers, one for general learning and support, the other for lived experience. And then I mentioned the system change learning guide, and we've got another guide being developed at the moment. So we think about lots of ways that we can connect people to share that learning and have that support across the programme. And we want to widen that as well to wider networks over the next 3 years too. Next slide. So this was just a few to sort of give a bit more detail on what I was thinking about in terms of the relationship between local and central. So I talked about visits and connection and how that can help teams to feel valued, but also they can welcome that challenge and that insight from the centre. And a quote here from these are quotes from different areas when we were asking for sort of feedback on the first phase. And someone said, in previous roles, I've sensed an antipathy between local and national. In this programme, it's felt really collegiate, and that's something that we really aspire to. But we obviously need to do more. And the next slide is some quotes about what people are asking more for in terms of, what more about what's going on at a government level, how is that collaboration working, and to see what's actually been acted on at a national level. And I think often it can be quite difficult because some things can take a really long time in policy terms. But we have seen some brilliant. We've got multiple disadvantages featured in the homelessness and rough sleeping strategy, in the violence against women and girls strategy, in the child poverty strategy. We've got targets in all of those. We've also now got the local outcomes framework as well, which features multiple disadvantages. So it's definitely an increased recognition. But we've developed stronger sort of governance structures with our different government departments, so we can make sure that we can get that feedback loop stronger in the second phase. And then finally, you'll be pleased to know, so I can keep quiet. Just wanted to mention one example of something that we've been doing that I think has been really exciting is a mutual mentoring programme. So I came across in Sussex a reverse mentoring programme between someone with lived experience and their programme lead. And I thought this would just be brilliant to link policymakers in government with people with lived experience of the policies that they're developing. Not because my colleagues are living in an ivory tower, but I think sometimes their ways of working with people with lived experience can be quite sort of over a short time. Whereas actually, I think it's really important to build those relationships over a longer time, if you like, to get more meaningful connections. So this is about connecting civil servants with people with lived experience, so that the civil servants can really learn from people with lived experience and improve their understanding of co-production, but also practical things as well. And for people with lived experience to receive professional development support, and also to learn about how government works, because actually that's been something that's come out really strongly, is actually understanding how decisions are made and how that works. But also help with interview practice and all sorts of other things as well, and just sort of mentoring to support them into the next step. So we're on to our second phase now of partnering people. So, for example, we had the director of homelessness and RUSEPing linked with someone who had experienced RUSEPing and across different departments as well. And fundamentally, this is about human connection. This is just about people connecting who might have very different life experiences from each other. And that's not to say that people working in the civil service don't have lived experience and multiple disadvantage, or that people on the lived experience side haven't worked in professional jobs. Of course, that's not the case, but it's about making these connections. And it's just, we've had such positive responses. It's been fantastic. I've got some quotes on the next slide just to give you a bit of a flavour. So these are some quotes from different experts by experience. She's been so encouraging and supportive. She's looked over an application form for me, given me a mock interview and written a supporting statement. And one of the individuals in the first phase was offered a job while they were in their mutual mentoring session with the civil servant. So it was absolutely fantastic. Other aspects were about increasing that understanding between civil servants and people outside the civil service. There's always an us and them, and how can this not work? But when you realise the acts, the legislation, strategies, etc., it becomes easier to understand why it's difficult to make change. And then a quote about loving learning and feeling valued, about offering their lived experience input. And then finally, a slide from give us a few quotes from civil servants. Skip to the other one. Somebody who said that mutual mentoring was one of the most impactful learning activities they've done, coming at problems from a different angle and thinking about delivering objectives in a different way, keeping the human story foremost in the data, and also lots of stuff about how to do co-production better. So we're building this into our lived experience support contract this time. So we will continue to do this work. And ultimately, what I would love to do is roll this out across the civil service for everyone doing policy, whatever area it is, to be connected to people that, in a mutual mentoring program with people that experience those decisions that they make, really. And that's it, really. I wasn't going to go into the local outcomes framework, Andrew, because I think perhaps we can come back to that if people are interested. But I mentioned that, it's now
that's a whole other webinar.
Yeah, it's a whole other thing. So I've got it there just in our back pocket in case we want to come back to it. But yeah, that's it for me. But really happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was a brilliant overview of what's come and what is forthcoming as well. So what I'd love to do is bring in the rest of the panelists, and be good to get your kind of brief at this point, general reflections. But there are three specific questions which have come in already that if you could just touch on, if appropriate. One is very much linked to what Jenny was saying around system change. So how do you get your whole organization to buy into public service reform? And I know this wasn't always the case for all Changing Futures programs, that was difficult, and that was one of the things that was difficult to achieve. Second point is around the use of data. How important is data integration and information sharing? Is that critical to it? And then the third point was around the role of people with lived experience, to say a little bit more about that. So if between you could pick up on some of that, that would help us get through the questions. But who would like to come in with their initial thoughts? Mark.
Okay, some honesty. I don't think we did get the whole organisation bought in systems change. And I don't think we got the whole partnership bought in systems change. but we got enough of them bought into it to be willing to try this and to iterate. I think it's about having enough curiosity and dissonance with the way things are to be able to move. I think if you wait for everybody to be up for systems change, I don't think that's really the right question. I think it's more about wanting change, and that might be at a level of system, practice, learning, relationship. I think it's important to change the system, but if we badge this as a systems change initiative, we're kind of othering it, because we have to change ourselves. We have to change the way we think and the way we see stuff. If you think it's a systems change piece, then you're almost excusing yourself from some of the more profound dissonance that happens. So how to get everyone to want systems change, I couldn't tell you. I can't ever say I've fully achieved that. I think creating enough dissonance with evidence for change, I think, is key. And it connects to one of the other questions as well, which is the use of information and data. I think there's two questions in there. One is sharing it and the other is using it. It's really hard to share it. And we work really hard to do that up in the Northeast. And Ron Charlton, I don't know if he's on the call or not, but he spent a lot of time and energy drawing up data sharing agreements to pull a lot of data together. But then having all the data in one place is one thing. Using it to learn and improve is another. And we tend to use data to keep score. Data tends to be collected for other people, whether it's inspectors, managers. And one of the key things was about using the data in a non-performative way. This isn't about performance information. This is kind of leading measures. What's guiding the work, what matters to people, and what patterns are we seeing, how predictable are some of the themes, and how idiosyncratic are the details. So I think there's something about we can just use that phrase data sharing fairly clumsily. I think it's more about how do we use information well to learn and improve at all those different levels. And yes, getting data sharing agreements so that we can build case histories up is one very notable and visible aspect of this, but I do think it runs a lot deeper than that. Oh, just on the lived experience one. Sorry, just come on in that as well.
Oh, sorry, please. Yeah.
Yeah, just on lived experience, I saw it in the chat. There were people in the program that I ran that were far more adept and knowledgeable about lived experience. But the principle we held was that half of the caseworkers had lived experience, and they were all paid the same. So it was really important that parity existed, and they were absolutely superb at this work and added a huge amount of richness to it. So yeah, I think at a level of principle, that's key. It was hard to do in practice because HR doesn't like paying for things that look ambiguous, and things that don't look ambiguous are less useful. But to come back to one of Jenny's points about this work being possible, that issue around parity seemed tricky, but it was possible. We didn't need to change the system to do it. We just had to look at it differently. So I hope that covers off some of the questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thomas.
Yeah, there's definitely some things in some of the points that Mark made, which I might come back to. So I suppose that point about making sure you've got enough of the system, enough of the people. So starting somewhere and kind of just going with it, even though in Greater Manchester we're never going to be satisfied with that. We do want to change the system. We'll come back to what that means in a minute. But there is a lot of kind of tricky system terminology in this work. So systems change, even lived experience as a phrase isn't recognised by human beings. It's just called people's lives. So just kind of recognise that in the work. But I was also probably just simply going to kind of validate and reinforce some of the points that Jenny made. I suppose just say this is true. It's not just in Jenny's presentation. So I suppose, first of all, that for us, and I think pretty much everybody on the call, so this was never just a programme, and that's kind of part of how that helped us kind of position it in the system. So this isn't a program that we're kind of setting up, looking at the parameters and pressing go. It is I know we use the term systems change in the GM kind of system, but it's about changing the way things work for people and the way things are set up in plain English. So it was always that from the start. I think it's in some ways unique. Maybe Jenny undersold it. I don't know if she did or not, but maybe undersold the sense that it made that very necessary link between real life, on the ground work, relational conversation, or just human to human interaction, with that quite kind of convoluted, sometimes boring work around systems change, accountability, funding, regulation, and making sure we weren't choosing between those, because I think we kind of had this mantra that doing good work was essential, but doing good work was never going to be enough, if that makes sense. And then just to make a kind of couple of points which related to kind of like doing this in conjunction with other investment and other delivery. So just practically, we over the kind of number of years have made the case to say this needs to be part of kind of wider investment budget decisions. So we have matched and doubled kind of the funding that kind of MHCLG are talking about, so we can work across all the geographies, but also all the different themes or parts of people's lives. But we've also made sure that it's embedded into a wider delivery model, movement kind of approach, which we call Live Well, which is basically all themes, all age supports for the things you need to live a good life. We occasionally use the phrase enhanced Live Well, but it doesn't matter what it's called. It means it needs to be able to work wherever you are in your life, whether it's multiple disadvantage or whether it's not. And I suppose that just picks up one of the other questions in the chat, which someone was talking about kind of the children families element. And whilst this particular program, if we want to use that word, is focused on that kind of gap around adults, in real life, that's not separate to children and families' lives at all. It's not separate to other themes. And that's kind of caused us a bit of tension when to kind of talking to other government departments, because we see them as the same things. It's the same kind of support around somebody's life. So we're trying to make sure we kind of address that through positioning and delivering this work through that wider Live Well approach. So I hope that helps.
That's really helpful, Thomas. Thank you very much. And I think that broader system change bit is really important. And maybe either at some point Hannah or Mark will tell us a little bit about some of the thinking we've kind of collectively been doing around the three modes that you look at this through, and the enabling environment is really important. And that's something that we're certainly very focused on in Mutual Ventures. If you can't get the leadership in a place to accept this and buy into it and feel that it's theirs, the whole experiment exists in a bubble that pops when the national funding is withdrawn or the really inspirational leader on the front line leaves. So, Bobby, it'd be great to get your thoughts now.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'll try and offer a few reflections, then pick up on some of those questions that have been asked in the chat at the same time. It's really helpful to have the overview of the programme from Jenny, and it's not an easy thing to sort of bring together and explain to people. And I thought that was a really helpful kind of way of setting out. But also as helpful, I think, is the way that you picked up on things that government value in this space, and particularly the kind of the value of relational approaches and learning. And I think, it's a cliche, but there's that thing, if you keep doing the same thing, you will get the same outcome. And I think that this program is trying to break through some of that. I guess the kind of scope of this as well, and kind of how it links into the kind of the wider sense of trying to reform how local systems work. And then, most importantly, probably for me, sustainability. And sustainability is everything here, and not easy to achieve. And you mentioned, Jenny, the number of different kind of approaches over the years, pilots, projects, programs that are about trying to bring together kind of interests at a local level. And I certainly see it, it comes out in national policy and guidance. It comes out in local areas of work. Very often it's kind of articulated from one partner's perspective. So, we can look at something like homelessness. We know that homelessness can't be resolved just through the provision of housing. Mental health and substance use and all those other things come into play there. We can look at it from a health perspective. We can have clinicians doing everything perfectly. If people are going back into circumstances that place them in harm's way, then they are going to come back into hospital again over and over. And I think the thing there is that there are those lasting interdependencies between different parts of the system that need to be brought together. And that's got to be something that is done for the long term, and difficult to do. The second thing I want to say around kind of buy-in, and I love the way that program has been kind of designed and the way it's being delivered. I think one of the things that is a little bit tricky about it is that the language can be a bit abstract. Multiple disadvantage. The name Changing Futures doesn't always necessarily convey the kind of scope of what we're trying to achieve here. And the hypothesis is a small-ish population of people, but a very big impact on services. One of the questions was about data. It is really fragmented. It's not kind of well recognized, invisible in a lot of data sets. Where we've been able to do some work on this, we can really see that playing out. So there was some really innovative work in Nottingham looking at our local mental health trust that found it was 20% of all interactions across the mental health trust's services were people experiencing SMD, but it was 40% of admissions to inpatient beds, and it was 50% of people who are then back within 1 month. And that dynamic plays out in lots of different places, whether it's about police interactions, prison, hospital attendances, A&E attendances, all of those different areas. The thing that helps to get traction, I think, is being able to say, actually, that's what we're looking at. It's not a sort of a separate side project. This is something that is having really significant outcomes on core outcomes for organizations, demand management, financial sustainability, people's lives, all of those sorts of things, really that can get the attention, I think, locally and get us kind of into a place where we're doing something on this. The final thing I wanted to say around sustainability is that it doesn't always sit well with the kind of established models of working. And I know that there's colleagues on the call who do a lot of work around new public management and its limitations and use of metrics and all that sort of stuff. Those things are not sensitive to multiple disadvantage and nonlinear recovery. They're not sensitive to the interactions across multiple different service areas. And they're also not very good at recognizing system change. And for me, that's where the benefits in this work are. You know, you can't resolve this through one super specialist navigator service. It is about that wider recognition by partners across the whole system of just that kind of need and vulnerability and impact on their service delivery, and a wider sort of upskilling and being able to respond to that in the right way, which to me is through partnerships.
Thank you very much, Bobby. I'm going to bring Hannah in, and just whilst Hannah is giving her reflections, I wonder if you could reflect on a couple of, everyone else could reflect on a couple of other specific questions which have come in, some which are specific, some which are more general. So there was a question linked to data around the use of predictive modeling and whether that is necessary, how to think about that, or any of the programs already talking about that. On the role of people with lived experience, there was a question as to whether there are any available documents or frameworks that could be useful for other programs. There was a question around is there consideration for gender-informed support in the context of violence against women and girls? So if just people could think about that. But Hannah, if you want to just come in with some of your general reflections, and of course feel free to pick up on any of that. But
well, thank you, Jenny, for that overview, and I agree that it feels like a really, really important time for systems change, and I think Changing Futures has been so core to that. And when you were talking about like not layering on, I was thinking about there's that historical perspective of, you know, we've got making every adult matter, we've had troubled families, we've had fulfilling lives, we've had total place, and all of those things have had so much in common in terms of, you know, being place-based, being learning orientated, being focused on systems change, using cohorts that are experiencing severe multiple disadvantage. And it feels like when you actually put all that together, if we could give that a sort of framework of significance, which, you know, I think relational public services is, then it really starts to look massive. So that's just the historical perspective. And then we've got all the same sort of fundamental features, cornerstones, principles in Test, Learn and Grow, Total Place, Come Back, place-based budgeting, you know, still Changing Futures even more. We've got more integrated neighbourhood teams. We've got human learning systems. There are so many, whether you call them programs, initiatives, movements, pieces of language, they all have all these same things in common. And what I think about I am one of those people who went on to gov.uk, Google, you know, Changing Futures, and then read all the evaluations. And I was like, oh, I should read all the evaluations for troubled families. And so I started reading lots of them and some of the technical annexes, and got lost with some of it. But what I wonder about is, what if we were to take a big step back and look at the the historical view of like the 20-year story plus this kind of cross-sectional, parallel story that we've got now. And I know that like Steve Reed, who's the Secretary of State for CLG, is really interested in like what's the language for how we express this to the public, so that it kind of seems like we have this framework of significance about who we are and what we do. And I just reflect on that from a stepped back kind of point of view, as not somebody who gets my boots covered in tar like a lot of you guys do. With delivering this work, and just think from evaluatively, there is a really, really, really massive story to tell. So yeah, that did you want to come back on that, Jenny?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we have produced, I don't think we've published it yet, but it will be on the site soon if it's not already, a review of all of that evidence, if you like, because we're really keen to sort of express that we don't think this is like a new thing, so it kind of captures all that evidence in one report. So hopefully that'll be useful with all the references on there. And I totally agree about all the other approaches. And it does feel like, I mean, I am quite easily excited, but I think it is a huge opportunity. And the work that's going on, in terms of devolution, and there's just so much happening. And so we are really well connected through this program. And I think we can use, and I'm sorry using the word program, but what else can I call it really? But I think it's a useful vehicle to do that work, isn't it? To sort of think about this group of people because of the cross-cutting nature of the work and the real importance of it and the urgency of it, to then think about what are these other themes. And I think our system maturity framework with those, because I'm quite practical in the way I'm thinking, in terms of the data and the workforce and the coordinated support, are quite useful headings to think about that reform through it. So we had our welcome event last week, very kindly hosted by Thomas in Greater Manchester for the New 18, and we started this conversation. We had representatives from all of our different government departments there on a panel, and I think Bobby was talking about this as well. And it's about thinking in a really practical way for me about what this looks like in one area where you've got these different reform programs. So we are working on this as we speak. So there will be more to come. So I think it's about really seizing that opportunity.
Yeah, and I think what I also really loved about this. So I think evaluators aren't very good at turning their evaluations into resources, and I think that turning evaluations into resources, or resources coming from them, is is a brilliant learning thing. And I know some people, as you were saying, Andrew, are interested in the kind of the data side, and I'd picked up that Fulfilling Lives had got like a common data framework. So there are some structural things that people have tried to do, whether that's been placed like locally or at a program level. But I think a lot of that was to kind of designed to minimize the story retelling on behalf of citizens. And I know that Changing Futures Northumbria, we're thinking about how to kind of, well, we're doing actually the scoping and specifications for how you would do kind of like bespoke learning platform type design. But yeah, I'm a fan.
Thank you, Hannah. So just there's a few things here that I'd like to come back to. So just a reminder that there was a question about predictive modeling, and certainly my recent experience of doing this, trying to support councils to do this type of work, you sometimes reach for that, but actually, if you just ask people within a community or people who are working in a community, you very quickly get your list of 100 people and families who really need help, and the modeling is sometimes not entirely necessary. And just as a reminder, I do want somebody to come back on any frameworks, documents for engaging with people with lived experience, and also the gender informed support. So, Bobby, I think you had your hand up first.
I was just going to add on the discussion around data. Data is really, really difficult, and it isn't something that has been built in. There isn't kind of recognition of multiple disadvantage in most of the data sets out there. But one of the things that is typically available. Wherever you go at any point of the system, they will ask about the wider circumstances. And so the work that was done with our mental health trust was about linking together retrospective client records where they've got recognition of homelessness, substance use, other things that correspond to multiple disadvantage. It's highly replicable, and it's not that difficult to do. And I think that very often people jump to the endpoint of fully integrated data sets as the thing that will answer a lot of the questions here. And I'm sure it will do, but not without significant investment, time, all that sort of stuff. I would really recommend this as a way of getting a building block to try and play out to individual partners. This is why it matters to you. I can share a link. Oh, if there's a way of sharing a link, I'm very happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Bobby. Thomas.
Yes, just about that point about predictive modeling. Is it necessary? I think it's valuable. And I think it's valuable if it's done right and you understand what it is and what it does and what it doesn't do. So I think you can also be too purist and say, well, data doesn't give us anything, predictive model doesn't give us anything. It's only by listening to people, etc., etc. Now, that's kind of true, but it's also like those two things together give you like the best insight, and especially if you're checking what the data is kind of telling you with people with real lived experience. I think that's where you get to, closer to the truth, if that's the thing. And so I think it's valuable, but it needs to come hand in hand with other kind of piece of insight, knowledge, learning, exploration, whatever you want to call it. So that'd be my response.
Thank you. Jenny.
Sorry, I was so busy listening. Parked over the hand. Just wanted to come back on the lived experience and the gender Vorg one. So in terms of the gender, I think one thing I really liked about Changing Futures was the addition of domestic abuse. So when I worked in local government and I was aware of fulfilling lives, I felt like, why isn't domestic abuse on there? Why isn't it one of the, the elements, if you like? So that has changed and shifted, I think, the work through the Changing Futures programme. And there has been a really strong emphasis in many areas on looking at gender and different communities as well. So there's lots of work on the impact of child removal and services around that. So I know Thomas can probably talk more. There's lots going on in Greater Manchester and Sheffield and other areas. And commissioned services to specialise in that support, but also wider training and thoughts about how systems need to be changed on that. And street sex workers as well. I know in Hull and many other areas, Leicester as well, they've been doing lots of work to support street sex workers. I think so one of the areas was saying that I think all of the women that were on the cohort had been involved in street sex work. So lots of work. Also getting people with lived experience involved in recommissioning services that can be more designed around gender and more appropriate for them. Women's specific services, because we know that many sort of generic services are actually designed around men. So lots of examples of work there as well. I think one of the evaluation reports focuses on that. So that is a theme, and will definitely continue to be a theme as well. And also there's many of the government department reps are, lead on things like women in the criminal justice system, etc., and violence against women and girls. And we feature in that strategy. So reducing violence against women and girls by 50% is one of the aims of the programme, if you like. In terms of lived experience, there's some brilliant resources. Plymouth did a co-production commissioning toolkit. So that's online. And then I think they recorded a webinar on how to use that. There's so many different models of involving people with lived experience. There'll be resources. I'm sure, Bobby, there's probably something on your PDU, isn't there, about that people can access. In terms of the mutual mentoring, I wanted to keep it really, really simple, as simple as possible and not over-engineer it. And it's literally just got people, matched them together. We did an introductory session, a suggestion for the first, what they might cover in their first session, made sure that there was support available for both parties. In case of any hiccups, and just let them get on with it, really, which can be scary, particularly for civil servants, not to have any objectives or aims or whatever, but just have those conversations and see what happens. And that's where the magic is, really.
Do you know, Jenny, I love that concept of having the conversations and seeing what happens. That's really difficult in public services. And I know it's even more difficult in central government than it is in local government. People like the false certainty of a robust business case. But Mark, I saw you did have your hand up there, and I just wanted to bring you in on whatever your reflections were. But there's a couple of other things that I think it would be good to get your thoughts on. One of the really good questions was around how you stop this drifting into becoming transactional. How do you preserve the relational bits of it? And then also there was a really good question, quite a difficult question around the changing commissioning landscape with ICBs changing, local government reorganization, turning a lot of areas inside out, and the aggregation and disaggregation of services. Really easy questions there, but what are your reflections on those? And then Bobby, I'll bring you in.
Okay, I'm going to do that thing where I slightly reframe your question, because let's not fall into the trope of relational good, transactional bad. That's not what we're saying. I think the existing system is a series of transactional deployments of specialisms knitted together by referral pathways and eligibility criteria. And if that's all you've got, you end up here. So we don't want that. And the way to unpick that is to work relationally with someone in the way that Jenny was describing initially, around having somebody who's on point, building the relationship, doing all of that, what we refer to as system agnostic stuff, all of the stuff that is of the relationship and doesn't require a specialism. And doing that bespoke is relational. And what it enables you to do is to pull on specialisms who are valuable and needed in context. Now, it may well be that the specific deployment of the specialism might be somebody having their teeth sorted out, might essentially be a specialist transaction, but the timing and nature of it and how it fits in with everything else is relational. The dentist doesn't necessarily have to be relational to do that well. So that might be a useful and vital transaction, but the whole context in which that is being done has been developed relationally. So I don't want to stop transactional work, but it has to be in context. And the absence of that creates a purely rules-based transactional system, which leads to loads of assess, do, refer cycles and loads of consumption and loads of waste. So it's not about stopping people wanting to do transactional stuff, because then it becomes attritional and intention, and it needn't be. Instead, I think it's about adding something to the system that's missing rather than bemoaning what's there. And again, and Jenny picked it up in the early presentation, the introduction of these low caseload generalist workers, for whatever phrase you want to use, the language needs work, needs refinement, but we'll go with that for now. If they are in there and their knowledge of context and the relationship they've built has the status it deserves amongst the network of specialisms, we're going to go a long way here, because it will be seen as it's a far better context to weigh up your deployment of your resources than eligibility criteria, which are arbitrary and there to essentially default to no. The system generally defaults to no. So I think I wouldn't want to frame the transactional relational continuum that way. I think it's much more about, the way I would frame it is moving from a system that requires us to navigate between specialisms into one that is capable of absorbing variety each and every time. And that absorption of variety requires us to do stuff that you're only doing with that person, the really bespoke non-specialist stuff, and really skillful and important introduction of transactional specialism, because we need that stuff. Of course we do. I would hate to think that this riles against that. So I think let's fight the right battle here. Let's not sort of pitch these things against each other. So that picks that question up. The commissioning one, yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think it was one of the things about Changing Futures Part 1 is, I remember when we were writing a bid and I talked about this being a project before the one we needed, because what it was essentially doing was creating an artificial environment for us to develop method. And boy, it did that. It did that really well. And it was such a privilege to be given the space to do that. So part one was developing relational practice. Can it happen? Does it work? But it also did a second thing, which was when you do that, how does it rub against the system, and where those points of friction are your clues as to where to work. But the program, I don't think, was able to fully address those issues unless you had willing partners in the first place. So the best thing we could do is work on those sorts of issues where people were willing and flag them when they weren't. And commissioning is a good example of one of those. The data was another one. There were a few. And I think what we were able to see is, a provider service that's in there doing something very transactionally because that's the way they've been commissioned, was rubbing and contrasting massively with the work that we were doing, to the point we were able to shine a light on that and say the root of that dissonance is the way it was commissioned. We can't necessarily solve that here, but we can absolutely articulate the difference between what a useful outcome and way of commissioning would have been versus what we've encountered when we've tried to do it a different way. So I think what part two does is it moves us from developing relational practice to the opportunity to develop a relational system. And that includes how might we commission, or indeed do we commission? I mean, this notion of commissioning wasn't always a thing, and the world went round then. It might simply be investment or grants or whatever it might be. Let's not have commissioning as a solution searching for a problem. I think we have an opportunity here to actually go back to what is commissioning. It's the allocation of money to make things happen. Okay, well, that's not the only way to do that. What are the archetypes of problems to solve or contexts that require us to think differently about the way money works, the amount of it, the malleability of it, the ability for us to absorb variety and deal with ambiguity? All of that stuff frames a slightly better question. So I think the changes going on with ICB, I'm working in South Yorkshire at the moment, and it's really difficult to try and get this stuff done when there's so much tumult. But it does offer us an opportunity. If these organisations are going through big changes, LGR as well, there's an opportunity for us to say, well, whilst we're reforming that, let's reform some of its central tenets around how we might do these things. And I think Changing Futures Part 2 and place-based budgeting as well offer us an opportunity to test that well, rather than just test method. So I think that's not a neat answer because it's a horrible question, but I think that's the ballpark we're in. I think there's definitely something about reframing this continuum between transaction and relational, and this whole notion that the only way to spend money is to commission. I think all of that, Changing Futures Part 1 has demonstrated that there's more to both of those than those questions. I think it's a bigger piece. I don't know.
Thank you, Mark.
Whether that's unhelpful.
No, really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to bring Bobby in now, but just to say, mostly to the panelists, I'm just going to change our ordering because there's so many questions here. I'm going to let this run just to get through as many of those questions as I can until about 11:30, and then we'll go back to what we were intending to talk about in terms of how this fits in the broader public service reform landscape. So, Bobby, would you like to come in?
I just thought there were some brilliant points that Mark had made there, particularly like the idea of this. This is the project before the project that we need. I think that's exactly right. And there is a kind of a thing of the environment that the system is working in that still really needs to be kind of addressed properly. And we shouldn't see some of the kind of the things that are tricky, like commissioning, as antagonistic. It's just about the way that they are expected to work and the pressures on them. So I think that's really important stuff to get into. And yeah, if we can pick that up in the conversation about how that can be reinforced with the public service reform stuff, that would be really good. Jenny mentioned the practice development unit there, and this is our kind of brilliant active shared learning community in Nottingham. If people are looking for frameworks on lived experience involvement, they will be on there alongside a whole host of other resources and things that hopefully people will find useful, and it's free. And if we can circulate a link afterwards, that would be great. And there's also a really quite thorough evaluation on the Changing Futures Nottingham website of involving people with lived experience in shaping systems, which would be worth looking at too. One quick point that I wanted to make around kind of the data and data maturity. I think there's something really important here about, and it relates to the point about commissioning. valuing some of the qualitative feedback. We haven't got the maturity around data at the moment, but this stuff has incredibly strong resonance with staff working across all areas. And we need to try and find a way of valuing that properly. And for me, again, it's about just trying to foster those really strong partnerships where you can get some of that feedback coming through from people.
Thank you very much, Bobby. So I've got a few more questions coming through here, which are excellent. There's one around the communities of practice, what worked well, how did you all share what you learned with each other? There's a very practical one about what a good Changing Futures delivery team looks like in terms of skills, seniority, specialisms, etc. Would be a really good one to get into. And then Mark, you'll be delighted to know Ron is here. Ron Charlton's here, and Ron has put in a really good, challenging question around what is the right way to do system change, and it should really be integral to the day-to-day work. And I think how I read and understand that is that we're doing some work in places where we're doing, Mark, you're doing this with us actually, where we're doing some test and learn experiments, and actually the learning from that is going to inform, we hope, the broader system change. So three questions there, two more practical and one more philosophical, I suppose. Jenny.
Yeah, so in terms of the team, others on the call will give more detail on how it worked for them locally. But based on the learning we had in the first phase, we have strongly recommended to any new areas that they build in, they use the funding for a certain number of specific posts that we know is going to really help. So you need a full-time program lead that is going to have the capacity and the space to do that senior sort of work, but also a system change lead as well, because I think it's too much to expect a program lead to kind of manage the program and do all that sort of liaison with the centre and everything else, and do all that system change work, which is really hard work and time consuming. A data lead is really important, and I could talk for hours about what kind of data lead, and it's great that Ron's on the call. It's not a useful phrase because there's so many different ways of using data. Obviously, we could talk for hours about the different forms of analysis, building case, but also the way to use data in a case management way as well. So perhaps strategic and operational types of data work, but having somebody dedicated is really vital to this because it's such a central part of the work. And then a lived experience lead, so somebody with enough seniority to bring that work into the strategic space and to make sure it's part of the governance and everything else. So not somebody that's like working in isolation and is just setting up forums and things, but somebody that's actually going to be able to have that sort of credibility to bring it into partners more generally. So I think that's really important. And I think that's it in terms of the different roles that we strongly suggested were important. And then the communities of practice, the ones that we have on the programme were actually set up by members of the programme themselves, not us. We sort of our support providers helped to sort of do the sort of some of the admin to take the load off, but we're actually really informal. So one of them was set up by Louise from Sussex, and just people just come together and talk about what's on their minds. We found that nearly every time data was the thing that was on everyone's minds. So we decided to set up a separate one on data because actually many of the sort of data specialists wanted to have that conversation. So we've had the two. We also had a lived experience community of practice as well. So we've done that, but we also have an in-person system change forum for all the program leads. And we just talked about commissioning. One of the themes of a session earlier this year was on relational commissioning. So we basically ask areas what they want to cover and bring in information or speakers, or just have those conversations ourselves. And they seem to have worked really well. But I think people really value just a space to allow to have that conversation, and without being judged, and to be kind of free about what the challenges are and what the difficulties are. And we find that really, really useful as well to sort of learn from and sort of, and then identify what are the support needs and everything.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to ring Thomas in, and then I'm going to put Ron's question to Hannah. Just give you a bit of prior warning there. Thomas.
Yeah, so just really quickly, I'm avoiding the philosophical one, just go for the practical ones. But just on that community to practice point, so again, what is a community practice? But I suppose I've interpreted that as different places to share and learn and do stuff, and kind of accepting it's okay to have, especially if you're talking about systems change across the board, it's okay to have different spaces for different types of issues, different types of people in the system, whether that's kind of getting into the kind of blood and guts of it on the ground, whether that's kind of service managers or kind of senior leaders or even kind of like the mayoral level. That's okay, and that's okay because you might want to get into some kind of pretty different, boring, challenging stuff, but the edges of those groups are fluid, so people are welcome in those different groups. It's just focused around different issues, and it's okay to actively intentionally collide some of those kind of spaces and communities of practice as well, because I think that gets you, it's not science, it's an art, by the way, but I think it gets you that kind of like system-wide conversation, which is as responsive to kind of conversational lived experiences kind of elements as it is to let's change the funding kind of points, which I think is really helpful. So, and I just wanted to pick up on that. What does a good team look like? Because I think Jenny talked about kind of like the overarching structure of a good team around kind of implementing change in futures, but I just want to pick it up from a frontline point of view. And this is kind of connected to this inside the system, outside the system. So there's a series of kind of the truth, which will be to say, the version of the truth, which say, let's have a really great kind of skilled, relational, generalist kind of crack team working around multiple disadvantage. And that works quite well. If you stop there, what tends to happen in reality is you kind of set up a really good thing outside of the system. So you end up kind of like knocking on the door of what might be referred to as specialists. So like social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., etc. So I would say the beauty of this is the coming together of people with experience, the voluntary community sector provision, and core statutory services. If you sit outside of those and you don't have those people in your team, it just ends up being a referral pot over there, for want of a better phrase. That's a problem. So a good team looks like it's the whole shebang, is my summary.
Thank you, Thomas. And just before coming to that wider question, Mark or Bobby, do you want to say anything on the team at all? Because I think that's a really good practical question that is important.
Absolutely. That's like, yeah, and I think Jenny mentioned it earlier, but I'd give a really strong push for this. And one of the things that we've done is have an embedded practitioner model, which is effectively a kind of an expert in multiple disadvantage at key points across the system, whether that's in A&E or in mental health trust, in probation, all those kind of places that people experiencing multiple disadvantage will interact with, and they wrestle to kind of respond in the right way. That has been really essential, actually, to understand what multiple disadvantage looks like in the demands and pressures for each part of the system, and to connect it to the whole, and to solve problems for staff, but also to be part of that network. And think about the team. Think about it being as facilitative. It's not just about having operational delivery nailed on. You do need some of that, I think. But there is a much broader effort and resource out there in the system, and people who are trying to deal with this. It's about empowering them to be able to do the things that will make a difference and to be able to link together in partnerships. So that's what I give my push for.
Thank you. Mark, did you have any reflections on the team? Because I know that you put a lot of thought into this and it was important.
Yeah, what I would say is I'd hate to standardize it. I think there is something about obviously you have a core of people. So I'm talking about delivery environment here. A core of people that are building those relationships and doing that work, and they will need someone to lead them, to help them. And this is critical, not just to manage them in a kind of pastoral sense and a sort of pay and ration sense, but who is actively coordinating and leading on the learning environment stuff. So running debriefs and making sure that patterns are spotted and all the rest of it, and paying attention to those things. And that is a really valuable skill. But the other thing I would say is, in terms of composition, it's more about what expertise do you need access to, and how frequently do you need it, because which would determine whether they're in a core team or what I refer to as an inner ring that surrounds that team, that are available for you to pull on. And if you're pulling on them every day, your data tells you, well, they should really be in the team. And if you're pulling on them every now and again, but when you pull, they're not very responsive. The problem to solve is how do we make it responsive? And if it is responsive, okay, we've cracked that. So rather than what is the best composition of a team, I wonder whether the question is what's a good arrangement for delivery and access to expertise? And you can start anywhere with that, as long as you're debriefing and measuring the frequency of those interactions based on the really good, valuable relational work. If you find that you're pulling on an OT every day, well, probably need an OT in this team. And that's the sort of way you, whatever your starting position is, you generate adaptation. So in Doncaster at the minute, working with some great people around neighbourhood health, and the intention there is to start with some GP practices and some people in those communities, and to not worry so much about the starting configuration, but to be really bothered about how we iterate it. So I think that start plausibly, and you don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Just move with it, and then see where it takes you, provided you're paying attention to the frequency with which you're pulling for expertise.
Thank you very much, Mark. So I'm going to transition us in now to the bit of the agenda where we were going to talk about changing futures in the wider reform landscape. And this is, Hannah, I'm going to come to you first on this, but just to set the scene, this very much links to Ron's question as to where the learning from this or where the work influences the system, because there is a lot going on. We've already mentioned the Test, Learn and Grow program. Mark just mentioned neighborhood health. There was a very good point in the chat or in the questions there about the Families First program, which is specifically focused on children. So we're Mutual Ventures are actually the delivery partner with DFE for that program. So that's a really important one. There's obviously changing futures, there's place-based budgeting, there's local government reorganization, there's the devolution agenda. All of this, there's a really complicated Venn diagram here somewhere. But how, so there's two big questions here. One is how can changing futures and as a proxy for all of the different programs influence wider and sustainable public service reform? And then there's a question about how it all fits together and if there is possibly a framework there. But Hannah, if I could come to you first, more focused on Ron's question, just about how the learning from change, because I know you've thought a lot about this, the learning from changing futures in particular should influence the wider system.
I might be able to segue to your next question by answering that one. So I've been getting a little bit caught up myself in thinking, what's the economic case? What's the commercial case? What's the financial case for relational public services in general? And that was inspired by the work that people were producing under the Changing Futures programme. But actually, when I was looking sort of over the bigger evaluations of Changing Futures, I think one of the things that the evaluation was sort of showing was that the system level, the organisational and system level stuff, remained quite closely related to the programme. So that was the harder part, wasn't it, to try and get that longer term sort of signature across the wider system, because of some of the issues that we were talking about earlier in relation to leadership buy-in, commissioner buy-in, all those sorts of things. So it got me thinking about, so if we kind of go with the new public management, this is about building a business case. The bits of the business case that aren't financial are the strategic case and the management case, and those actually seem like bits that Changing Futures could really focus on creating much more evidence around. And I know that is an intention for them. So there was a caveat around the accountability ceiling, so this sort of threshold at which longer term outcomes in theories of change are kind of outside of the programme, so they can't be directly influenced. And I think some of the stuff that we've got around Test, Learn and Grow and Total Place and making connections to those things help with that, and so does place-based stuff in general. But I was reflecting on there's been quite a few evaluations that I've done that have not been related to this stuff, where I've done consensus exercises, like I've done little Delphi studies and things where you ask people, what do you believe about the outcomes that a certain program is trying to produce? And when you ask multi-agencies about the outcomes they're trying to produce for individuals, for citizens, there's nearly unanimous consensus and agreement. And when you ask them what they want for staff, it's nearly unanimous consensus and agreement. But when you ask them about their organisational priorities, it achieves very little consensus. And that is natural. By nature, organisations and systems are looking after their own. And I've seen this in actual Delphi studies. So yeah, we end up with very little agreement on sort of organisational stuff. And while we hold those kind of service orientated structures in place through commissioning and procurement and performance management and staffing, staff belongs to my organisation. They don't belong to the system, even though, NHS England might close down, ICB may change, and those people may actually just move around the system. And if it was a place, you might say, well, the staff remain, we've retained that member of staff, but actually the organisation says that it hasn't. So there's few incentives for that. It kind of goes back to the collaboration thing. But if we tackle those things and not get sort of hijacked by the compulsion to demonstrate the economic, financial, commercial cases, I think Changing Futures has got a real intent to really, if we think of it in business case terms, to really help populate evidence around the strategic case by doing more, not just alignment, but informing strategic priorities, not just aligning with them, but actually informing and developing them. And the management case, is the system actually capable of delivering relational public services? And does it have robust sort of systems and processes in place? So I think that this is kind of for me, this would be the purpose, or one of the purposes of learning, because there are people like in Thomas's team in Greater Manchester, they've actually Greater Manchester have produced a cost benefit analysis tool for these sorts of things. So we've got so much of that, but we don't have that learning framework of significance that sort of that builds everything together. And I think that making sure that the sort of sense making work very, very tightly overlaps with the enabling strategic work and the actual service work, I think that's really, really critical. And just some specific, I just wanted to say a couple of specifics on how to kind of move those questions forward, because I think, Mark, you were talking about like kind of reframing questions. And I think I can imagine a situation where you've got systems kind of, instead of asking that kind of very compliance orientated, what if X, what if Y, that defensive position, what if such and such happens, we can ask even if such and such happens. So moving from what if to even if. So things like, what if the people we help, we can't, the ways in which we help people aren't told formally, but and we can't demonstrate cost savings. And that's really, really uncomfortable in the boardroom, or in the oversight committee. Instead, we could say, even if we cannot demonstrate cost savings in the boardroom and that's uncomfortable, we know we've still helped people in ways untold, or even if this person doesn't meet the eligibility criteria, we can say, instead of saying what if they don't meet the eligibility criteria, we can say even if they don't meet the eligibility criteria, we resource these cases on our best and most contextualized understanding of the cohort that we're trying to work with. So I think reframing the questions, as Mark was saying, to that sort of non-compliance defensive orientated way feels really, really key to me in the types of data that we generate. And I suppose the other point I would just make on that is, I think there has to be a real plurality to this. So I think that the way that people set up their learning is very unique to the places and the relationships that are in them, and also plurality in the methodologies and measures that people use. I think that those are also needing seem to work best when they're generative and when people have like my colleague Rob Wilson talks about mensuration, which if you look it up is a mathematical thing, but actually it's about the making of measures, which I think is such a cool thing.
Brilliant, Hannah. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. And Thomas, I'll bring you in now, but there's just been a great question at the end there about, it's essentially posing the question is this a new service? Or is it actually drawing together stuff that already exists? So that I'd love to get people's eyes on views on that. But Thomas, more broadly, how does this fit with everything
Yeah,
else?
so
How should this influence?
I was going to try and simplify that kind of breadcrumb between what we're doing here in Changing Futures and Multiple Disadvantages into some pretty revolutionary work around, you might call it public service reform, we might call it deeper devolution, reform of the state, whatever you want to call it. So I think I'd start by saying what you see in the multiple disadvantages or Changing Futures space is you see all the issues, the challenges and the solutions to all parts of the public service system and a lot of societal challenges in flashing lights. So I always say it's like the microcosm of kind of like a lens on the system, which you get in little bits in other areas, but you get it every last bit in the multiple disadvantages space. And I suppose just kind of follow through the logic of that. So this model, if we want to call it a model, and I'll give you some system language because that's kind of the point I'm trying to make initially. So the model relies on the full kind of integration of resources, delivery and support across sectors and types of work. It relies on place-based or person-centered or relational decision-making, the ability to capture benefits across the system. And we would say, so without kind of whole-scale public service reform, which includes, from our point of view, much deeper devolution and budget shifting, costs and benefits will always sit in different parts of the system. We'll always have this kind of circular conversation around resourcing and commissioning, etc. No single actor will ever have the incentive to fully mainstream or I'd say lock in this kind of approach, this relational or preventative approach. And we would say, so with that shift, with kind of system shift, full public service reform, full devolution, we can align funding across the system, across the state. We can use it better for the purposes of people. We can use it more in a relational and good transactional way. We can invest on the basis of value, if that makes sense. We can capture the kind of benefits across the system and reinvest. So our core argument would be to say only that system can unlock the full relational and preventative value of the model by aligning those incentives, aligning the funding and the accountability around the person, or to use the system language, person-centered or place-based kind of outcomes, if you like. So that would be the kind of logic that would say, how does this work linked to that kind of revolutionary kind of public service reform, devolution work? So I hope that made sense, at least.
Yeah, it does. Mark, if I could ask you now, I know in advance that you're going to challenge the framing of this question, and it's kind of deliberate that I'm framing it this way, but is this a new service or is this something different?
You're making me sound like I'm a really awkward customer now, Andrew.
No, it's great the way that you describe this, because I know you think this isn't a service, and you're exactly right.
Yeah, and it isn't a service. I think Oliver makes a point in the chat about that, and I think that's that. I think somebody does. Apology if I've got the wrong name there.
No,
It isn't.
no, it is Oliver.
Yeah, I think I remember vividly being at pains to describe the work we were doing as not being a service, and not just Changing Futures. All of the other that work personally for me was preceded by a whole bunch of other prototypes, which helped me develop my grounding in this sort of work. And I was always loath to describe any of them as a new service. We were trying to develop a method, and we were trying to create evidence for changing the system whilst we did that. So it was a means by which we might choose to do business as usual differently, as opposed to layer on another service. So I think we can be fairly, it might require us to redesign services, but it doesn't mean it's a service, because that immediately others it a bit like, oh, this is just a systems change piece. It immediately puts it in a box over there. It's important that we go into this fully expecting to be changing the way we think, not because we're in any way deficient. It's just that learning is central to it. So yeah, I think that's a fairly straightforward one in terms of being able to say what this isn't. Yeah, I think that helps. What was
Thank
the
you,
other bit of the
Mark.
question? Is it a new service? Was there another bit? Forgive me.
No, I think that was the main thing that I
Okay.
wanted
Yeah, I think
ask you.
it's a good question because I think it's right to be explicit about that when we
Yeah.
can be.
And Jenny, I'd love to come to you after this next question, just to put to you about how this fits with other things which are going on in government, particularly Test, Learn and Grow and things which obviously Changing Futures has influenced. But to give you a bit of prior warning on that, there's a really good question which has come in from Mark towards the end there, which this isn't how Mark has phrased it, but I'm going to phrase it in a more provocative way. So how do you stop this type of work becoming almost like a cult with a bunch of rebels who are constantly, it's their raison d'etre to battle the system, when actually the way you would affect real change is to work with people and bring as many people on the journey as possible. So I'd love to get your views on that. And I'm sure that's not how any of you work, but I know that there are some people who advocate for relational public services who maybe think it is a never-ending battle against the evil empire. Anybody got any
I'm
thoughts on
happy
that?
to.
Jenny.
Jenny was first. Sorry, I should have put my hand up.
Okay, fair enough. Jenny.
Well, I would just say that it's kind of working in that just human connection way, isn't it? It's understanding where people are coming from. Everybody wants to work in that way. Everybody wants to work in a, connecting human to human, and have services that have got low caseloads, and people aren't just trying to be mean, are they? People are coming. Everyone is trying to make serve. Otherwise, they'd be doing other jobs. They'd be doing other things. So I think it's just trying to understand where people are coming from, and then thinking about it from their perspective and talking their language and seeing the benefits to them, and trying to help them overcome the barriers. That's how I would. And having done partnership working for decades, that's, I think, the best way of doing it. And I think, yeah, it's good to have to challenge and to have dissonance to a degree. But I think there is a danger in coming at it from that perspective, because you set up the barriers from the start and you say, I'm coming in, I know better, I'm going to change your system that's rubbish. And I think that's never going to work with anybody, is it? So that would just be my approach. And I'll let the others. Everyone else wants to come in, so I won't talk about the other wider question, Andrew, till after.
No problem at all. I think Thomas. I think I have no idea how to tell here who put their hand up first, but let's go Thomas, Bobby, Mark, and then Hannah.
Yeah, again, it won't be like here's an answer, but I would just assert that that's like a flashing lights problem for the Royals. So this can't be a us and them cheerleading evangelical thing. And actually, there's great irony in that. Because actually, if we are serious about learning, if we are serious about deep listening, and if this is about kind of inclusivity and kind of understanding, we can't just go and go, you're wrong. So, and actually, there are, when you get into that deep listening space, there are reasons behind things, not saying the right or the wrong, but there are reasons why people act in a certain way. There are reasons why things are set up in a certain way. So actually, I would just kind of advocate for holding that dear as a kind of core philosophy as you kind of move through systems change, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. Bobby.
So I really agree with that reflection that there are reasons why people act in a certain way, and I also really agree with what Hannah was saying about system dynamics, I suppose, and system priorities are absolutely secondary to organizational priorities, and most of the organizations that we're working with and trying to kind of get on board with some of this stuff, it is about squaring off the financial pressures against the absolute priorities and the things that they are governed to deliver. The thing I suppose that I am excited about in Changing Futures is that it is built around learning. We do have more connections through to the civil servants governing those different bits of our local system. We've already seen things like inclusion health, which is a really helpful articulation of something really quite close to multiple disadvantage from a health perspective. And the more of that we can leverage, and more that we can kind of create the case together, I guess, the more buy-in that we're going to be able to achieve in being able to do this kind of work. But for me, it's about collective ownership. It's not about kind of us and them. We've got to try and find a way of, having a really dispersed, broad program that brings together and reconciles the different interests that are out there.
Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, it's an age-old question, and I think there's a balancing act here, because on the one hand, we don't want to wait for everybody to really want this before we start, as well as we never start. But at the same time, we don't want to get to a position where it becomes a kind of us and them proposition. So your intervention tactics are every bit as important as your system design stuff. So thinking about where being able to succeed in this, it's about giving people the opportunity to learn with you. And I always say you can't, it's not about trying to talk somebody into something. It's about providing a basis for an informed choice. So I look at myself in the mirror and say, have I provided the best basis I can, experiences and evidence to give, to allow for an informed choice? And if the choice is I'm still not having it, then I don't know what else I can do. So I don't have a magic answer to that question. But what I would also say is, by doing that, I think more people in this space are generally respond positively to that, and they come along with you than don't. But I don't think there's always going to be people that don't see it that way. That there'll be the point was made by Hannah and Bobby about the organizational imperative might be unrelated or override the imperatives that you're surfacing from a system point of view, or there just may be something going on in there. Um, there's an as queer as folk, as they say, and I think that's part of this. So, um, yeah, I think providing a basis for an informed choice, helping people to learn with you, all the usual stuff gets you as far as you can, and in many cases that's sufficient, but it isn't always. And I don't think you'll ever totally avoid conflict with this stuff when it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's a question of how can we do that well and kindly.
Yeah. And this is necessarily messy, right? This is about relationships mostly. And that's not a scientific thing. That is a very subjective thing. And I think it's part of the reason why I think this whole relational endeavor pushes back against the traditional false certainty of business cases. It is about the very specific nature of what you're doing in a particular context. And relationships are messy. Hannah.
Yes, indeed. I was just thinking about the use of principles, because I know they're used at the program level, Jenny, and I saw them close up, and the idea of method in Changing Futures Northumbria, and I think I'm thinking about them in relation to the rules of engagement, the principles that we hold each other to when we decide to do something that's multi-stakeholder or multi-agency. And it was reminding me of Lankelly Chase used to have, or do if they're still around, uh, system behaviours. I think there were 9 of them, and it was like power and participation and something. But it was fantastic because when you were in meetings with them, they had the principles on the wall and they used them, and they would say, are we, respecting all types of evidence here when we say that, when you just say that, are we doing that? And that obviously developed trust, but it held people to account. So I think the idea of using principles in a system and not just in the way that we do casework is one thing. And the other thing I was thinking about was the shorthand that I've started to adopt, which is learning with, from, and about each other. And I think that this is a key sort of shorthand for the way that we relate to one another. So learning with people, I suppose, is, nobody knows this, so we're going to have to work it out together. The learning from each other is the kind of what wisdom can I share, or what wisdom can you share with me? And the learning about each other is like the who are you stuff, And I think that when you've got all of those, that comes from interprofessional education. And when you have all of those together, I think that those are some of the ingredients for kind of movement building, and for also making sure that you understand when people are, not on with it anymore. So I've seen people, especially in the Quaker organisations like Joseph Frenchy Charitable Trust, they'll say, well, what do you need to come along? Things like that. So there are some real rules of engagement that Helen Sanderson and people like that are excellent at being fairly practical about.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So, Jenny, coming back to you, if people can remember, it was a while ago now that question about how this fits with other programs that are going on in central government.
Yeah, so that you've set me a difficult task in 30 seconds. How does it all fit together? I think it is challenging, isn't it? So I can't give you that answer in that time, and I think some of the programs fit together more closely than others. And then there are other programs that aren't badged as public service reform, but do involve very similar kind of ethos and outcomes. So one of those, of course, would be the long-term rough sleeping work, where and the system change in that. So I think there's a number of different things that we need to work on. One is language, and we've talked quite a bit about that today. And Bobby referred to the health inclusion work and the different languages used in different sectors. And when we're trying to do this work, that can be a challenge. So I think there are some things we can work on around that. And there's mechanisms. So I talked about our system maturity framework. Well, in the long-term rough sleeping world, they want to do that too. So we've had conversations with them, and they're going to use the same one as ours. So it's about kind of trying to see where we're not going to ask areas to do things multiple times for similar cohorts of people. And then I think there's sort of making sense of, because some of the programs they're in different areas, what does it look like locally? And so I was just came straight from a meeting this morning with colleagues to discuss some work that we're doing on that. So I think I mentioned earlier, we had Nick Kimber, Director of Public Service Reform from the Cabinet Office. He was at our welcome event last week, and we were having, our other colleagues from across different departments, we were having starting that discussion through the framework of changing futures, if you like, about what does that look locally. So I can't say that this is, I can't give you like a really neat answer to that. I think it's a work in progress, and using Hannah's phrase, I think that's great about learning, with and from and about each other. That's how this will work. So we're doing some really exciting work at the moment, conversation centrally about helping areas see the practical ways of how that looks in a local area, sort of something tangible, which is always kind of something I'm really keen to do. So I could talk longer, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour, really.
It does. Thanks, Jenny. And I think the one thing for certain is that if you look across those programs, there are some really common themes that could be drawn together into a cross government reforms strategy at some stage. But that is really helpful. Thank you. So with our last 5, 10 minutes, I'd love just to get practical again. So one of the things we said that we would cover would be some practical things. So from your perspectives, what should areas who are, let's say launching a new Changing Futures program, what sort of things should they be thinking about first? And I realize this could be a long answer, but just a few snippets of practical things would be brilliant. Who would like to go first? Mark.
I'm going to reflect on something that I saw again yesterday. So yesterday I was down in Pembrokeshire. There's a fantastic team of people working out of Milford Haven they're not doing Changing Futures, but they're doing this kind of work. They're doing relational practice in a particular community out of a location, and what they're doing brilliantly before they really pile on heavy work, they are actively working with people. But before they did that, they just went out to all the active partners in the area, not to say, come and join our strategic program, but more, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially they were saying, we're doing this work, we're gonna come knocking at some point. And I'm talking about local voluntary community sector organizations or the school, and just almost set the scene for it. So when I've done work like that, I've always tended to do it in a more kind of almost overthink it and try and do it too, purely strategically, and that's no bad thing. But what I'm seeing in Pembrokeshire is that they've prepared the ground much more pragmatically and relationally. Who'd have thought? And that is already meaning that when they're pulling for expertise and pulling for support locally, they're getting it. I was listening to them yesterday talking about their early successes, the speed at which they are learning far quicker than I ever did. So there's loads of things to think about, and other people will have much more strategic answers. But I couldn't not mention what I saw yesterday and reflected on, and it feeds back into the community of practice thing. Changing Futures is not the only show in town. Nobody thinks it is, but there is a movement here around this. So another good early thing to do would be immerse yourself in that movement. Just find out what's going on. So yeah, lots of other things. I let other people cover those, but they are great pragmatic things to do, and you're going to learn more than you realised. I certainly have. I'm doing, and I've done this work for years.
Thank you very much, Mark. Jenny.
Yeah, this is a question that we ask areas when we're doing our quarterly conversations with the 15 of the first phase, and it's one of the questions we're asking them all. And I would say first thing is don't panic. So because it's a big thing, isn't it? So just don't panic, because you'll get there in the end, and you'll learn stuff on the way. So don't worry, and there's lots of support out there. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing would be practically get people on board, recruit people, because you can't do this alone. And if you're doing a normal day job, we all know what that's like. You're still doing your full-time work and you're trying to do this on top of that. So get recruiting as fast as you can to get a team around you. And then the other thing would be linked to what Mark's saying, really, is get out there talking to partners. And one of the things that we did differently this time around was to try and facilitate that in a tiny way, was we had our initial conversations with all the 18 and then said, right, before you we confirm the funding, we want you to go out to all your partners and have conversations with them and sign up to a form that you can change and adapt. You can add people, you can take them off, but get them to sign up to say that they want to be part of this, so that you're trying to, from the very initial, even before you've got the funding, you're trying to build that partnership. And it's about having those conversations and being clear. It's not a pilot, it's not that program, it's something more.
Thank you very much. Thomas, just briefly in a minute or so, and I've got Bobby and Hannah.
I'll do the fast version, so I'll skip out some bits, but I'll talk about getting the team right then. So I think it kind of relates to what Jenny was talking about before, but get your team right. But when I say get your team right, I mean get people from different parts of the system with different interests, and to put it more bluntly, different types of the personality spectrum. So get a good mix of people from finance to policy people to frontline people to people with lived experience, get them together, lock them into a kind of team, and then get going. So I've got rid of some other stuff in the spirit of time, but that's a good one.
Thank you. I'll come back to you if we've got time. Bobby.
I'd really just echo what Jenny has said. Don't do it in isolation. Strategically look at that kind of alignment. What do partners need, and what do they need to do, and how can it fit together? Get a wide and inclusive partnership together around this. Make sure that it's not just a kind of an isolated program. In terms of the model, do things that will facilitate that. Communities of practice, learning communities, all of those sorts of things that are needed. And then secondly, have a real think about start at the finish with this. What are the challenges going to be in ongoing sustainability? What might the pitfalls be, whether it's data, whether it's kind of changes in staffing that might kind of lose that kind of collective memory? What are the things you need to kind of prepare for and get in place early?
Brilliant. Hannah.
Just from bits I'd picked up from the evaluations on this, I think really paying attention to the importance of the caseworker in terms of developing intrinsic motivation. And I think one of the top tips from that was where people were being trained in trauma-informed skills. That might seem like an early thing to do. And I suppose I should say something about learning as well in relation to Ron's point earlier on. That possibly sort of incorporating reflective practice as a principle, even if it's at a place space. I think that could be a really interesting way to kind of consolidate and galvanize that. And because what it would also then mean is that leaders have to learn. So the people who are hosting Changing Futures, the leadership in those organizations are not exempt from learning if it's going to achieve the organizational and systems change stuff. And one way to do that would be, well, we've got a theory of change for the whole program that local Changing Futures sites could maybe have, like learning frameworks. This is a way to do developmental work.
Thank you. Thomas, do you wanna pick up on a couple of those other things in your list just in another minute?
There was a couple, yeah. So I suppose like talking about principles. So I would say when you get that crack team together, whatever it is, set out your principles, write them down. It's not to say they're going to stick or anything, but just kind of get people in the same headspace. And I think Bobby used the phrase "start at the finish," which I'm just going to pinch. So I think make sure you have an initial idea and write down collectively where you want to get to. And when I say where you want to get to, I mean, obviously it'd be kind of easy to describe for the individual, but I mean for services, both statutory and otherwise, and also for the system, for commissioning, for funding, get it out explicitly, get it kind of visible at a very senior and other level, and make sure you kind of keep coming back to that. Because I think as you start to work, you go off on different lines. It's really good to kind of keep you anchored. I suppose it's a practical way of describing a theory of change, if I'm being honest. But anyway, there you go.
Thank you very much. Mark, do you want to do something really quickly there? I can't hear Mark. Can anybody else hear Mark? No.
Sorry, I double
Yeah, got you now.
Just going back to the very beginning, one thing I would say is don't be afraid to start slowly. It feels like a productivity test. It isn't. So you've got really busy people in a live environment suddenly working with fewer people and thinking they should be busier than they are. It doesn't always happen that way, but it often does. I would say hold your nerve on that and just don't be afraid to get into a different rhythm because you, as Hannah said, you're building in reflective practice, thinking about what the message to leaders is. So don't be scared of starting slowly. It will pick up, you will get slicker. So one of the leadership behaviors is to create the conditions for a slower pace at the beginning. Because if this feels like a productivity test from the start, then you're going to miss out on some really valuable learning.
Thank you very much, Mark. Right, that's fantastic. I can't believe that's been 2 hours. It feels like it's flown by. I've really enjoyed it, but I'm probably biased given that I've been involved in it with you. But thank you so much to Jenny, Thomas, Hannah, Mark, Bobby. Thanks to everybody who joined. We've held on to most of our watchers over 2 hours, which is always a good sign. We will send out a follow-up email that will have Jenny's slides. She's happy to share those, and also a link to the recording of this as well. So please do feel free to share that.